The reverse of that is the adversaries of the West are always savages. You see, that's the colonial mindset that the West goes into the colony to civilize people. When the colonial rises up and fights back, they are being savages. Every time the Chinese resisted the opium wars and so on, the Chinese were treated as savages in the media. Like, how dare you fight? And if you fight brutally. When the Indians rose up in 1857, in the great Indian uprising of 1857 against British rule, every British newspaper said these are savages, they conduct atrocities. After that war ended, Indians who were caught by the British were strapped to cannons, and the cannons were fired as a warning to others not to fight. I mean, it's a brutal repression of people, and yet that doesn't change the impression of the West as aggressive. The West is always doing things for human rights, and the savages are always wrong.
I really appreciate you think we're having a very nutritious talk. But if you were someone from CNN and possibly our talk is going to be an article saying I'm a yellow supremacist, nationalism. When they talk about American people, they're going to use something like a patriot. Well, even we know like it's keep flushing and the aggregation. You're not having the right to flush.
Here's my message to the Chinese people. Wake up, okay? The New York Times, Wall Street Journal, CNN, these are not reliable. These are not models of good journalism. Wake up. I don't understand why you think the New York Times is a reliable model of journalism. The New York Times lied in 2002, 2003 around the Iraq war. They had a journalist who basically took intelligence reports and published them. Later, she was disgraced and so on. The New York Times consistently makes up stuff. During the war in Syria, I knew the bureau. I was based in Beirut as well. I interacted with the bureau all the time. They're very nice people, super people. But I mean, look at the stories they ran. So my first comment is wake up, okay? Don't believe that CNN is the gold standard of journalism. That's ridiculous. That makes me feel like I feel a little ill when you said, oh, in China, it's seen as, and I'm saying, no, stop it. That's the first thing, okay? Then I would say that, look, what is journalism? What are we talking about? Journalism is got to be understood as using reliable, understood to be true sources to show people what's happening in the world, sincerely. We don't strive for quote unquote the truth, okay? Because that's very hard, and I'm not a philosopher, so I don't know what that means, but I would like to be credible and readable. And those are the two standards of good journalism. I want to tell you a story about something happening in the world, but I would like to be credible and I would like to be readable. I would like you to understand what I'm saying. I don't want to be too complicated, That seems to me is what journalism is about. The New York Times is not credible. It may be readable. It's often very well written, but it's not credible. Because when you look at a New York Times story, here's the sourcing. US State Department officials said, US officials said, intelligence officials said, US State Department said, Biden administration said, Republican minority leader said. That's the sourcing. How is that a story? If they're writing a story about something to do with China, they'll talk to 3 people in a think tank in Washington, D.C., but they won't take seriously people in China, let alone officials in the Chinese government. Chinese spokesperson said. What about that? Why don't they quote the Russian foreign ministry spokesperson? She's an incredibly charismatic person. No, they don't quote her. They'll quote somebody from Carnegie in Washington, D.C. to talk about what's happening in Russia. Or they'll quote somebody from a bizarre think tank in Washington to talk about China. But they won't come in and talk to even Chinese intellectuals. That's interesting to me. China has been able to eradicate absolute poverty. Why don't you take that on faith? What is the incentive to lie about that? Write one story that says that they are saying that here, we have abolished poverty, absolute poverty, and this is what we've done. And then do a story telling you how that was done. That's interesting. Not a story casting doubt about whether it actually happened, and then quoting somebody from Washington, D.C. In that sense, I would say, hello, friends, we've got to have high standards for journalism. One of the standards is to take people seriously. I interview people in the US government all the time. I take them seriously. I don't disregard them. But I don't understand why the US press doesn't take, say, Chinese or Indian, intellectuals or, people who are in government and in the state bureaucracy. Why are they so suspicious about them? Why don't they take them seriously? It tells you a lot about the world that they are not given the time of day. And this comes to the issue of respect again.
I'm very thankful that most of them I met are very respectful, especially those from The Guardian, while those from CNN are totally different. Talking about
Wait a minute. Let me give you an example of this. You would have seen it. In December of 2021, the New York Times ran a big story called How Beijing Influences the Influencers.
Yeah.
Yes. So this is the New York Times. What was the story about? I took that story seriously because I had been on a program with Jing Li. And in the story, they had a photograph of Jing Li and myself. They didn't go into that, but that was there. So I was like, what the heck is it? Anyway, what was the story about? It was mainly about people from the United States who live in China and have YouTube channels. And, they'll go to like Kunming, and they'll be in the bazaar in Kunming and they'll say, look at this great food. And, wow, this is a fish, whatever. Some of them are not at that level. Some will say, look, what's happening in Xinjiang is misunderstood and I've been there and whatever. So there are some political things, some just social and cultural, like, look, I'm on the train or amazing train here, that kind of thing. What was the story? The story said that these people were basically either in the pay of the government of China or that they were doing the work of the government of China. What about that they are just young Americans who are in China and they come from places in the United States where the public transport is terrible or there are no trains, and they get on board one of these high-speed trains and they're like, wow, what is this? I'm in another century. Why can't they be sincere people? Why should they be again portrayed in the New York Times as somehow in the pay of somebody? So that's the New York Times, pals. That's the New York Times. Figure out that this is who you're dealing with. I mean, I agree with you. Even the reporters for that story probably were very nice when they talked to people. But look at the headline, how Beijing influences the influencers. My God, immediately takes away the agency of these young people who are out there doing their own thing. I went back and I watched a few of their videos, just to see. These are like young Generation X, Generation Z, whatever people.
And just using like the scan to pay on their phone. I'm like, I've never tried that in the state. How good is it? And they say like, the Chinese government paid.
This is exactly it, right? And that's not some tabloid. That's the New York Times. And it was a big story, It was a big story. It was to delegitimize these voice of mainly young people from the United States, but also people like Jing Li, who is popular, she's a very good presenter. This is a way to delegitimize all of them. It's the same thing that they did a decade ago to RT.